Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Um, Me and Sandra today, we're excited to get to talk with you a little bit about some of the silk authorities and some of the work that can be started and how that can impact your state council. So to start off, my name is Jeremy Morris. I am with the Ohio Statewide Independent Living Council. And Sydney, if you could go to the next slide. So we'll start off with a little bit of the background of what exactly is a silk authority. So they're still relatively new. We're still using new for it. The authorities were added to the Rehab Act in 2014.
Oh, Jeremy, I think you got frozen.
They are optional.
There you go. You were back on now.
I apologize for that. If I cut out again, I may just cut the video to keep the audio stable.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where I cut out, but the new authorities were enacted as part of the Rehab Act in 2014. They are optional for state councils to engage in, and they are limited. The Rehab Act provides a list of activities that a silk can do, and that's assuming they are also included in your state plan for independent living. So like I said, every state council has different duties that they are required to be pursuing, but the authorities are the optional work that the silks can begin engaging in. Next slide. So a little bit of what is actually allowed in the law. So some of the language from the Rehab Act around the silk authorities includes working with the Centers for Independent Living to coordinate services with public and private entities to improve services provided to individuals with disabilities, to conduct resource development activities to support the activities described in this bill and or to support the provision of independent living services by the Centers for Independent Living, and to perform such other functions consistent with the purpose of and part that are comparable to other functions described in Section 705C of the Act. So the silk also has to determine what is appropriate, and it has to be authorized in this bill. So that is a very important thing. Everyone just went through their state planning process. Some of us, most of us, are still finalizing and making a couple corrections, but make sure that there is something in your state plan if it is something you want to be engaging in. And an important note on this, all silk activities, they must comply with other applicable federal laws. So with the silk authorities, you can't bypass anything written otherwhere in federal law. You can't get any extra leeway or any other authority just because you write it into this bill. It is still defined to what is required and what is allowed in the Rehab Act. Next slide. So now we get to start talking a little bit about the actual fun that you can start having with this. And I see one of the questions is, what is SPIL? And I apologize. We try not to use acronyms, but it's the State Plan for Independent Living. That is the SPIL. So going back, what can this mean in real life? Specifically with the coordination with the Centers for Independent Living. So this can involve things like working with the CILs and managed care organizations to ensure that community-based services are available, working with statewide organizations to improve communication and coordination with CILs during disasters, connecting CILs with Developmental Disability Council, Area Agency on Aging, and the Aging and Disability Resource Centers in your state, advocating for additional services and better coordination to your state legislature or state agencies. So it's really getting a lot of activity that is working with the state council and your centers for independent living so that everyone is working together and really finding new opportunities. Next slide. And here's where I'm going to pass off to Sandra.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandra Brighton-Gross-Bitter. I am the Executive Director of the Texas State Independent Living Council. Thank you so much for the introduction to what we were talking about today, Jeremy. So when we're talking about what these silk authorities can mean in real life, here are some examples of the Resource Development Authority. So this could mean helping SILs directly secure funds or in-kind resources, such as contracts, grants, equipment, supplies, volunteers, things like that. It also can mean securing and administering grants to be awarded to Centers for Independent Living. And that can be in a relationship such as a subrecipient relationship or as a center to silk partner, could be as a contractor. But again, as Jeremy had mentioned, we still need to make sure that the other rules restricting the silk's role in providing independent living services is still respected. So for example, silks would not be providing those services directly. That would be for the centers to provide. It could also mean the securing new resources to conduct spill activities such as outreach or activities that you've described in your goals and objectives. Next slide, please. Sorry. And also the last section of the silk authorities talks about board directed activities within the limits of the law and the state plan. And this is a really broad language that I think it's interesting to look at, and to look at it in the context of the direction of the silk, which is a consumer controlled entity, and then also what direction is provided in the state plan, which again has been drafted by the Centers for Independent Living and by the silk, and at the direction and with the input of the people with disabilities in your state. So this is really what's going to drive some of those additional activities. So that could be conducting additional outreach for under or unserved populations. There were several provisions in your state plan where you would have outlined which populations, whether or not it's a geographical population, a racial population, a disability population, or various cultures that the state needs to do further outreach. There might be an underserved population because of resources, funding, or it could be other reasons why there would be an underserved or unserved population in the state. Also, looking at your activities to further the goals and objectives. You could look at different activities with ensuring your silk appointments and your resources, as well as developing, monitoring, and evaluating the state plan for independent living. Next slide, please. There are a couple of things to consider when thinking about all the various possibilities of what you can do with the new authorities that have been given to us through the latest reauthorization of the Rehab Act. So really look at Section 705 of the Rehab Act, which most silks are pretty familiar with, but it's always good to go back and look at it and look at specifically what is outlined with regards to the requirements, the duties of the silk, and what they are supposed to be doing with regards to the state plan. And also, I've included the site there for the Code of Federal Regulations where these provisions are included. You also should look at what your state plan says. And as Jeremy mentioned, most folks are finishing out their process with their state plan. And so when looking at your plan, look in section 1, which is the goals and objectives section, and see how the silk has been listed as providing support for the goals, objectives, and activities of the network. Is there a defined role in section 2, which is looking at the outreach to specific populations and coordination of services? So this could be really broad language about what the silk will do, or it could be a matter of just stating that the state will work together with the centers on outreach to those populations that have been identified as underserved. Also, you want to look at section 5, which is I consider it the silk section, but it basically has several provisions in it where the silk goes through and talks about how it remains autonomous and how it'll perform its duties as well as resources. And so there you might see some language about how the silk will perform its duties and authorities and the resources it'll use to do that work. And also looking at what the silk board has to say. Has the silk provided direction? And if not, then that might be something to talk about as a board of what different activities will be conducted that might be outside of the state plan or are within the general parameters of the state plan, but you might need additional direction from the board. So those are some things to consider when looking at the large group of activities that we can be talking about with our authorities. Next slide, please. So next we want to talk about some state examples. And Jeremy and I are going to go through, talk about different ways that Texas and Ohio are working through their state plan process and through their board process to exercise some of their authorities that have been outlined in the Rehab Act. But while we're doing this, I want you all to think about what other states might be doing, and feel free to include that information in the chat so we can voice that as well. If you have some examples of some things that your state might be doing that, with these authorities, I think it's really good to hear and to share as peers to talk about what great ideas are out there. And I know when looking at each state, we are all so uniquely different. And so it's pretty easy to get a little bit overwhelmed with comparing your state to another state about what they might be doing. But we're going to go through some of the examples of what we've been doing and how we've gotten started. So with Texas, we first started to look at the specific advocacy topics and activities that were defined in our state plan in section 1, which is our goals and objectives, to really look at where the state would be focusing its advocacy and some of the activities. Now, of course, there would be a lot of activities happening within each center on a wide breadth of issues, but those are just a handful of things that we've all agreed that we should focus on a statewide direction. So we started there. And some of the, one of our goals included increasing discussions and advocacy on transportation, specifically accessible transportation. So in conversations with our Silk board, we started to really look at ways that we could expand transportation advocacy, but still make sure that we're within the defined roles of the Silk, so that we're not going out trying to provide accessible transportation, but we can coordinate on statewide conversations of advocacy on accessible transportation. We can coordinate with centers to increase transportation training for consumers. And so there's a lot that we could do. And so that's where we started on that. And that ended up evolving over time into a project of looking at ways that we could have an annual statewide conversation on transportation on an annual basis. And so that started our Accessible Transportation Summits. Then we looked at another advocacy topic that we talked about in our state plan, and that was housing. So specifically accessible housing. We had defined it as a spill objective, listed the Silk as a potential partner. When it was originally written, we didn't yet know exactly how the Silk was going to partner on this topic, other than potentially finding additional resources and ways that the SILs could create new local partnerships with housing advocates and developers. So that again evolved into a project that we're working with several centers for independent living on accessible transportation, or not accessible transportation, sorry, accessible housing. And so again, we went through our spill goals and objectives and really tried to keep an open mind, look at what opportunities were available, and then go from there. So I'm gonna, before I go on to some of the other ways that we worked on this, I'm gonna send it over to Jeremy so he can talk about some of the advocacy opportunities that Ohio did.
Thanks, Sandra. In Ohio, we started off with some very similar approaches. We really had to reshift the way we looked at advocacy and make it more of a structured process that was a constant conversation. And part of that was our council actually created a committee that was geared towards advocacy for the first time. So we hadn't had that focus from an actual committee as our own structure in the past. So that committee was able to start looking more at different topics that were coming up across Ohio, really inviting other stakeholders in and talking about what they were seeing and what impacts they were seeing across the state. So that was a really strong start for us of just forming that structure internally, bringing in those other stakeholders. But we realized that there were other ways that we needed to strengthen our own capacity. And one of the things that we ended up doing was partnering with one of the centers for independent living here. There was one particular center that has a very strong advocacy department. They have multiple staff dedicated to their advocacy team, which a lot of the other centers don't have that capacity amongst themselves. So we worked with them, and they are actually doing a lot of work where they're providing us brief analysis of what is going on with different pieces of legislation, state policies, regulations, and how it's impacting the community in Ohio. So with that, we are able to have a lot better information that really educates and informs our own advocacy positions. With that analysis, we're able to share that across the network of centers. We're able to share that with our advocacy committee, and we're able to talk a lot more effectively about these topics. And we will draft and submit public testimony on different pieces of legislation as an interested party. So we provide them with the facts of how it impacts the disability community and what the potential impacts could be. But we never take a stance of supporting or opposing that particular legislation when we're submitting that testimony, because we don't want to engage in those lobbying activities on a regular basis like that. We are providing the resources and information of how certain things may impact the disability community. And it's been interesting because we have found certain areas that we didn't expect to be engaging in. One example that I like to share is there was a bill last year that was going to regulate the electric scooters that you see popping up in a lot of major metro areas. And there were certain things that were put into that legislation that it wasn't there for any benefit necessarily of individuals with disabilities, but it actually had a very good benefit. You know, there were certain fines that could be imposed for parking in any of the curb cuts or any of the passive travel. It made it that they would have to have an audible signal for people. So we were able to highlight that there were actually some really positive things for the disability community in this piece of legislation that people weren't aware of. And through this work, our advocacy committee has really grown much stronger, and it's helped direct the advocacy work in our state plan now. So we have in our state plan, we created a process that annually that advocacy committee is going to create a series of action steps that our committee is going to be working on and our SILC is going to be working on, so that we can be more responsive instead of what we had done in the past through our advocacy goals in the state plan of really just counting how many hours were spent across the network. We wanted a little bit more ability to create a true response and really start engaging in a lot better advocacy. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sandra.
All right, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the coordination that we're doing on a statewide basis, both with other organizations and centers for independent living. So one of the things that we engage in is doing some coordination with our protection and advocacy agency, which is Disability Rights Texas, and a group of other disability advocates, such as Adaptive Texas, ARC of Texas, things like that, where we can join together on several like-minded goals, and we are more active during our state legislative cycle, and we can really monitor things together and keep an eye out for the priorities that each organization has set, and really help each other out through the process, because we all don't have enough resources to have full-time policy or legislative folks. And so this is really a way that we can coordinate and take advantage of the collective intelligence of the statewide group. And not only are we able to work with some of these entities, but some of our more active centers that are active on statewide legislation and advocacy priorities are also active in that group as well. And then some of the other ways that we are coordinating is the SILC works pretty closely with an emergency coordination group that meets statewide, and that coordinates on disaster preparation, as well as communication and services during a disaster. And so when we're not actively in a disaster, we meet monthly and quarterly on a statewide basis with agency staff, state agency staff, as well as other state disability groups such as our DD Council, again, the ARC of Texas. We have folks from various groups that all come together and again, help coordinate on some of the emergency management priorities and advocacy issues that we're seeing on a statewide basis. We also receive the information from service providers like Centers for Independent Living about what they're seeing on the ground. And so if those policy recommendations need to come out of what's happening on the ground, that we can coordinate on that level. We also work really closely with our Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities and our Developmental Disabilities Council. So making sure that where we have similar priorities on advocacy and within our respective plans, that we can coordinate and create some synergy among those entities. And so again, that's ways that we like to work together, and that we're using some of those authorities on coordination and being more active than we have in the past before those specific authorities were outlined. And another way, I'm going to talk really quick about some outreach activities and then put it over to Jeremy to talk about what Ohio is doing with regards to outreach. But so with regards to some of the outreach activities, we looked at our state PPRs and looked at what type of services were being provided on a statewide basis, and then also looked at our census data to see what the population looked like for the disability population, bumped it up against racial data, et cetera, and tried to see where there were gaps. And some of those gaps were identified in our state plan, and then others were identified through input through a town hall process with Centers for Independent Living. And those were then identified as priorities, whether or not it was specific geographic populations or disability populations. And then we do a lot of outreach with regards to a specific format. We call it a town hall format. We know that the Rehab Act requires you to have public hearings, but when we started calling them public hearings, I think people just automatically fell asleep because no one wants to sit through a public hearing, right? So, but we did want to hear from the community. And so we started coordinating town halls with Centers for Independent Living and hosting some of those town halls either at the center if they had space, or co-hosting the events with centers. And we really used it as an opportunity to hear the needs of the local community, as well as hearing statewide advocacy priorities or where there were gaps in services. And so it really ended up being a great way for the community to coordinate, as well as to conduct outreach, and for new individuals to hear about Centers for Independent Living, as well as what was happening on the silk level. And that has been really successful for us. We also have duplicated that into a virtual format. We started doing this before the pandemic required everything to be virtual, and it was really successful. We ended up getting a lot more input from areas that we couldn't meet and reach in person, whether or not it was because there were transportation issues in rural parts of Texas, or there were issues with regards to timing of our meetings and things like that. So we started conducting virtual town halls during the day, and we've conducted a few in the evenings to allow different groups to participate. And it's really been successful, and we've then had some great statewide conversations on policy priorities. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jeremy, and he can talk about what they're doing in Ohio.
So I think that this is one of the most fun authorities, because it really is a way that you as a silk can really build a lot stronger relationships and partnerships with the centers in your state. And really, to me, that's where a lot of this work ends up beginning, because you do have to have, you know, a relationship that is either strong or strengthening with the centers for them to want to coordinate with you. You know, it really, once things get started, it is, you know, a lot that can come through from it. I have fun with the idea of finding more and more organizations or people that don't know what the SILs are doing, and getting them in front of the SILs, getting them connected to what the centers are doing. And sometimes it's just partnerships are naturally forming. We do have, you know, a couple examples that have been really successful, and then we have some that are really just getting off the ground started. So one of the things that we were able to do, it was around 2 years ago, with the state of Ohio. Once the Money Follows the Person grant funding was ending, the state was redesigning the program. So previously, the centers were all involved in the Money Follows the Person program, and the way the state was redesigning it, they were cutting it down to 2 providers for the entire state. None of the centers had the capacity to go after that contract themselves. They didn't meet all of the requirements that were being laid out for the contract. So I went around trying to find who would be applying for that. And I was able to find 2 organizations that were applying for it, brought the information back to the centers, and I helped coordinate and work with both groups. And those 2 different organizations wrote the centers into their proposal with the state. Unfortunately, only one of them got funded, but it allowed for at least a chunk of the Centers for Independent Living to continue getting funded through the state for nursing home and institutional transition services. That's something that, you know, it would have taken a lot more coordination. It made it very easy and effective for the Silk to help find those other organizations that on a statewide level were working. And most of them had a good relationship with the centers in the past, but they didn't know every single center out there. So we were able to help really pitch and sell them on the idea of working with the centers it's going to be better for your proposal in the end, because the centers are so good at this work. Something that is just starting actually this month. So I don't know exactly how it's going to work out. It's the Coalition for Housing and Homelessness in Ohio. They have run a program for the last several years that trains organizational staff on the Social Security and Social Security disability application process. And they were going after a grant that was going to expand their training. So we were able to work with them, and they included the SILs in that proposal. So over the next 3 years of them having that grant, they are going to be reaching out to all of the Centers for Independent Living in our state to get staff trained on how to be more effective through that process, provide them technical support on understanding the process better, because especially with that nursing home transition piece, we have seen issues that there's new applications that are coming through, and there's a lot of situations that having that basis of information will help the SILs be more effective in the services that they are providing. Another one that actually just started this morning. We as Silk have been working very actively with our other partners in the state that are funded through the Administration for Community Living. Through this work, there were several of us that came together and a new coalition has been formed. It's the Ohio Home and Community-Based Services Coalition. So through that, all of the centers have now been invited and brought on. And this coalition's main focus is, especially right now, when we know that there's going to be potential cuts to services and programs, how can we as a large collective group come together to promote the need for actual expansion to the home and community-based service infrastructure throughout the state? So bringing the 12 centers for independent living on board, there's over 50 organizations and individuals who are now part of that coalition that, from the Silk being one of the leads at that table, we were able to bring everyone on board. And it's going to help coordinate a lot of those activities across the state, because we're looking at how can we have consistent and common messaging. In terms of outreach, this is something that it's going to be more new for us. We are looking at coordinating with centers to do forums with the local universities and try and get more input from the college age youth with disabilities about what they're seeing in the community, and trying to get more people involved in independent living at the college level to try and foster a little bit more leadership. And, you know, for us as Silk, hopefully find some new council members and get some more people involved. For the centers, you know, hopefully they could find some future leaders for their centers through this process. Sure that we are doing that type of outreach in a coordinated way, because we know that the centers locally have a lot better relationships with those local universities than we do. And it would be a great opportunity for us to go in together and talk about independent living from both that local level and from the state level. And from that, I'll pass it back to Sandra to talk a little bit about resource development.
Yes. Hold on. Let me start my video again. Okay. So I talked a little bit about resource development, and I know I've given some other presentations about what resource development in Texas looks like, but we really I want to talk a little bit about where it all started, and how we look at the ways that new resources, whether they're grants or contracts, can fit within the Silk's authorities and our duties. And it really all circles back to the state plan. And so that drives all of our resource development, is looking at new way where there are gaps in funding or capacity, and where the Silk might be able to try to go after additional funding opportunities and partner with Centers for Independent Living on those. So most of the grants that we have, we are partnering with Centers for Independent Living, other disability organizations, or we are doing some advocacy work and coordination ourselves as the Silk. And so it's really important to go back and look at the priorities that you have set as a state, and then start to look at maybe the priorities that other funders have set. So for example, we looked at the state plan of our GD Council in Texas, and looked at the ways where, or looked at the priorities that were similar. So for example, one of them was transportation, and our DD Council ended up offering up some grant funds in a proposal on protection, or not protection, I'm sorry, on advocacy and leadership. And we decided to go ahead and submit a proposal focusing on transportation with regards to advocacy for accessible transportation. And that was able to fulfill objectives in our state plan, in the independent living state plan, but also in the DD Council's state plan. They had identified transportation as one of their priorities as well. And so we really, that's been our strategy, is to look at what it says in our spill. And so if you look at it right now, and you'll look at some of the advocacy priorities regarding transportation, housing, transition from institutions, whether they're nursing homes or state institutions, into community-based living and providing that peer support. We also have some priorities listed with regards to either mobile or virtual independent living services. And so that's where we've focused some of our resources. And resource development can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be grants. It could be donations, or monetary donations, of course, are nice, but it could be in-kind donations, volunteers, things like that. And so that's kind of what Texas has done. And you guys can also always reach out and ask additional questions if you have them about our specific projects. But I want to make sure that Jeremy has a chance to talk about what Ohio is doing.
Thanks, Sandra. So this was a very new area for us to get involved in. We really weren't sure exactly where we were starting in a lot of ways. And I think some tips for some state councils that are looking into this type of resource development. There's a lot of resources on grant writing and how to search for foundation funding and different things like that. And that's been one thing that we have been looking more into, and we realized this would be great information to also send out to the Centers for Independent Living to make sure that they have access to these same types of resources. So one thing that has come out of that now is we have resources and information on different funding opportunities from local foundations that we send out to the center directors. And we are trying to provide them with information of how can you develop and build the resource capacity of your own Center for Independent Living. We've also been able to undergo and take on two, for us, really large projects. And in both of those projects, the goal was we were going to be looking at the overall picture of it, and the centers were going to be receiving funding through a sub-grant agreement. One thing that was really important in both of those applications that we did for funding, we made sure that boundary, that the Silk was not going to be providing or managing direct services to individuals, was included in that proposal. We made sure that through that process, there was going to be kind of a firewall that separated the Silk from that element. We really wanted the SILs to have the opportunity to develop and structure the programs that would best fit their communities, best fit the individuals that they're serving. While they do have to report on the activities, the reporting structure has been set up for them to just report to us based on the objectives that they identified for their center. So we are making sure that we are giving the center the programmatic control of their project as it goes forward. And through each project, we ensure that if there are needs for the programmatic assistance, we have somebody who is more knowledgeable than we are that actually understands that is involved almost as a third party. because we want to make sure that if the centers are actually needing some type of additional feedback, we probably wouldn't necessarily have the best answers at times. One of the projects is around emergency and disaster response and preparedness. We know a little bit and we know enough, but we do not know the ins and outs of how the centers could be more actively engaged. The other project is around the Youth Leadership Forum, which, if anyone was listening yesterday, one of the staff from the Ability Center of Greater Toledo, they were presenting and they talked a little bit about that. Through that process, it was the designated state entity. They wanted to shift the way Youth Leadership Forum was run. So we had worked with them and really highlighted the Centers for Independent Living are a great partner for you. You know, it's kind of bringing in all these authorities together. The centers are a really great partner. They can pull this work off better than anyone else. So they released a request for proposals to have an organization that could help facilitate 5 regional forums. We worked with the centers on that application. We made sure that they had input, they were given the proposals, they were part of that process. And we made sure for each of those projects, our council actually, they had a discussion about it and they voted to approve our council even going forward with applying for those sets of funding. We wanted to make sure that as transparent and open as we could be throughout that process, we were. And I think it's really started to work out really well, and it's helping build a really good partnership with us and the centers too. For our own related fundraising, or I'm sorry, not fundraising, resource development, we have a new grant from our DD Council, and it relates to not only our advocacy work, but our outreach that we identified. Because part of it is the DD Council reached out to us and said, we think that there's an issue in the way self-advocacy is being promoted in the DD system in our state. Would you help us take a look at how this is happening? So through this project, we have a group of individuals that we've convened that are representatives from the independent living side. So we have a couple council members, we have SIL staff, and then there's individuals that have come from the DD Council and the DD side that are coming together, and they're talking about what are the systemic issues that prevent individuals from having true opportunities to engage in their own self-advocacy. So we're having a lot of really great talk and communication about this, and it led to a report that got developed with the recommendations from the group of what they thought needed changed in our state. So we're now working again with the DD Council on how can that be implemented? What policy changes and what systemic changes need to happen to allow greater self-advocacy? So it's really helping to promote independent living through other systems within our state. And I see there's a couple questions. The first one, if a SILC is not a 501c3, can the DSE receive grant funds on their behalf? I'm not entirely sure. I would think that's possible. I think that it would just making sure that the DSE and the SILC do have a good relationship, and that the DSE would allow the SILC to conduct that project or program the way that they want to, and make sure that that autonomy isn't interfered with. I don't know if Sandra has any input on that.
I think that is definitely possible. I think it depends on the grant. Not all, there's, a lot of times there will be grants that are only available for nonprofits, and others that governmental entities are allowed to apply for them. But again, I think that starts with a conversation with your DSE as well. There might be other organizations that could act as your fiscal agent as a possibility. And so I would definitely look at that, but also keep in mind the conversation of making sure there's silk autonomy with that process. Looks like we also have another question. It says, if you're an organization that wants to collaborate with their silk, do you have any suggestions on how to start that conversation or ways that you can collaborate with your council? I think one of the ways is first approaching either specific board members if staff is not available. But also each silk meeting has a public comment process. It's required by law. And so if for some reason you're having a hard time reaching staff or individual board members, I think showing up to board meetings and talking about your willingness or your organization's willingness to collaborate and start some more in-depth conversations is a great place to start. But reaching out to staff and to the board and really looking at what the state plan says with regards to the priorities might give some clues as to what the priorities of the silk and the centers are. So that's my recommendation. I'll send it over to Jeremy.
And just to add, one thing I'll tell you, as silk staff, I love when another organization comes and says, you know, would you be able to see if we could present at a council or a committee meeting? And typically our council members, you know, they jump on the opportunity to have another group come in and talk about what they're doing, how they're engaging with the individuals with disabilities in Ohio in whatever way it is. And it's really helped bring about, you know, they typically come to the meeting and they don't immediately leave. They will stay and listen in. And so it helps us actually, you know, when we get to hear about them, ask them questions, talk to them, and then they hang out and stay and they listen to what we're doing and they hear more about what the silk and the sills are doing. And it really starts bringing up more conversations that are becoming a lot more impactful as we go on. Do we have any questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat, or I mean in the Q&A tab, but I do want to voice some of the chat coming in saying that for Wyoming, it says we have something like that here in Wyoming. We call it the WYDPAC, which is the Wyoming Disability Peer Advocacy Committee. We meet every Friday and work on advocacy through legislation and ADA concerns and such. I think that's awesome. I think that's a great group, especially meeting weekly. You're really able to split the work burden on within several different organizations and really coordinate and work together. So that sounds like a great opportunity.
And just as a quick note, if you are on the phone or have a microphone and you wanted to ask a question or make a comment, you can do that by pressing *9, and that lets me know you would like to join in. I am going to go ahead and share the screen just one more time so that we can share your contact information.
Yes, and you're always welcome to reach out to us and send us a quick email. Let us know if you have any questions or just want to talk out some ideas. I think that you know, while we can't be there in person all together this year, sometimes we just need a little bit of peer support among among silks and board members and things like that. And so feel free to call and talk it out. You all have some really great ideas that I've written down today, and I would love to see if they will work in Texas. and love to hear from other states about what you all might be doing too. So I think keeping up this conversation and as we go along, I think it would be really neat to see how other states are using their new authorities. They're new. I mean, it's 6 years old, but it's new to me.
It's still new.
It's still new. So I appreciate it, and thank you for having us today.
And I just want to add too, one thing, it's really good to share information on what you're doing, but it's also good to share information on the challenges and struggles that you're facing as a silk. I know, like I said earlier, we went through some major restructuring, and that's what's helped promote our advocacy work. If it wasn't for the fact that we saw, we weren't that effective the way we were structured, we wouldn't be able to engage in some of the advocacy we're at. So sharing, how you're going to try and overcome some of the obstacles you're running into, or even if you just need to troubleshoot with us of, how can we start doing some of this, because we have certain barriers or challenges. We're always available to try and just talk through things.
This is Sidna again. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Sandra. I appreciate both of you. That was a very good session. I do want to remind all the participants to please fill out your evaluations. As soon as this session is over, the link for that evaluation should appear. And if you all have any more questions, you can reach us through the April conference webpage. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.